Jake Coleman had worked ranches across Wyoming for 38 years and knew better than to follow wild horses into the darkness. But when a Palomino Mustang appeared outside his cabin at midnight, circling and calling out with sounds of pure distress, every instinct told Jake something was catastrophically wrong. The horse's behavior defied everything Jake understood about wild animals. Mustangs avoided humans, especially at night. Yet this one was deliberately trying to get Jake's attention, then bolting toward the forest and returning, over and over, in a pattern of unmistakable urgency. Against his better judgment, Jake saddled his horse, grabbed his rifle and flashlight, and followed that Mustang into the pitch-black wilderness. What he found, 3 miles into those dark woods, was so terrifying that Jake would later tell investigators he'd never felt closer to death. Because waiting in the darkness was something that explained why this wild horse had risked everything to bring a human into the night, and why every second counted. Subscribe now for incredible true stories that will leave you speechless and prove that sometimes animals know when evil walks among us. Jake Coleman's remote Wyoming cabin sat at the edge of the Bridger-Teton National Forest, accessible only by a rough dirt road that most people avoided. At 61 years old, Jake preferred the isolation. After decades working on crowded ranches with constant noise and activity, he'd bought this small piece of land 5 years ago to spend his semi-retirement in peace, doing occasional consulting work for neighboring ranches while living simply. It was October, and the nights were getting cold. Jake had been asleep for maybe 2 hours when the sound woke him, a horse calling out, high-pitched and urgent. He sat up immediately, his decades of experience telling him this wasn't the casual whinny of wild horses passing through. This was distress. Jake pulled on his boots and jacket, grabbed the powerful flashlight he kept by the door, and stepped onto his porch. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, his breath visible in the moonlight. He swept the flashlight across his property and froze. A wild Mustang stood about 30 yards from his cabin. The horse was a Palomino, unusual coloring for the wild herds in this area. Cream, golden coat with a white-blonde mane that seemed to glow in the moonlight. The Mustang was pacing, circling, calling out repeatedly. When Jake's flashlight beam hit the horse, instead of bolting as any wild animal should, the Mustang took several steps toward him, then turned and galloped about 50 yards toward the tree line. Then it stopped, looked back, and called out again. Jake's blood ran cold. He'd seen this behavior before, but never from a wild horse. Only from domestic horses, trained animals who had learned that humans could help. This was deliberate communication. This horse wanted Jake to follow. "What's wrong, boy?" Jake called out, though he felt foolish speaking to a wild animal. "What are you trying to tell me?" The Mustang repeated the pattern. Gallop toward the forest, stop, look back, call out. The urgency in the horse's voice sent chills down Jake's spine. Something was desperately wrong in those woods. Jake made a decision. He went back inside, put on warmer clothes, grabbed his rifle, because Wyoming wilderness at night held bears, mountain lions, and worse, and saddled his quarter horse, Dakota. Within 15 minutes, he was mounted and following the Palomino Mustang into the darkness. The Mustang stayed just ahead, visible in Jake's flashlight beam, constantly checking to make sure Jake was following. They moved into the forest, the temperature dropping further under the dense canopy of trees. Jake's breath came out in white puffs, and Dakota's hooves crunched on the frozen ground. After about 20 minutes of steady riding, Jake estimated they were nearly 2 miles from his cabin. The terrain was getting rougher. Steep slopes, dense undergrowth, fallen logs. The Mustang never hesitated, navigating the darkness with the sure-footedness of an animal that knew this territory intimately. Then Jake heard it. Beneath the sound of their movement through the forest, beneath the wind in the trees, there was another sound. Crying. Human crying. A child. Jake's heart began pounding. A child out here, at midnight, in freezing temperatures, miles from any road or habitation. The questions racing through his mind were all terrifying. Lost, injured, or something worse. The Mustang's pace increased, and Jake urged Dakota faster. The crying grew louder, more desperate. Then the Mustang stopped at the edge of what appeared to be an old mining area. There were abandoned mine shafts throughout this region, dangerous relics from Wyoming's gold rush era. Jake dismounted, rifle in one hand and flashlight in the other, and moved forward carefully. What he saw in the beam of his flashlight made his blood turn to ice. There were two children, a girl who looked about 8 years old and a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. They were huddled together against a large boulder, dressed inadequately for the freezing night in just jeans and thin jackets. The girl was crying, holding her younger brother, both of them shaking violently from the cold. But that wasn't the terrifying part. Tied to a tree about 15 feet from the children, gagged and semi-conscious, was a woman in her 30s. Her face was badly bruised, one eye swollen shut. Her hands were bound behind her back with rope, her legs tied together. She was dressed in what looked like professional clothing, slacks and a blouse, now torn and dirty. And standing over all of them, his back to Jake, was a man holding a shovel. He was in the process of digging what could only be described as a grave. Jake's mind processed the scene in milliseconds. This wasn't an accident or a tragedy. This was a crime in progress. This was attempted murder, possibly kidnapping, happening right now in the wilderness he called home. The Palomino Mustang stood off to the side, still agitated, pawing the ground. The man with the shovel hadn't heard Jake's approach over the sound of his own digging and the children's crying. Jake had perhaps 5 seconds before the man would notice him. 5 seconds to decide how to handle a situation where 3 lives hung in the balance and an armed criminal stood between him and potential victims. Jake raised his rifle, his hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Don't move," he said, his voice cutting through the night with absolute authority. "Drop the shovel and get on the ground. Now." The man spun around, shock and rage contorting his features. He was younger than Jake, maybe 40, with a cold, calculating look in his eyes even caught in the act. "This is none of your business, old man. Turn around and ride away." "I said drop the shovel," Jake repeated, taking 2 steps forward. "I've got a rifle aimed at your center mass, and at this range, I don't miss. You've got 3 seconds. The man's eyes darted around, calculating odds. Jake could see him considering whether he could reach his own weapon. There appeared to be a gun in a holster on his belt before Jake could fire. "Don't try it," Jake said quietly. "I've been hunting in these woods longer than you've been alive. Whatever you're thinking about doing, I promise you won't make it." The girl, brave despite her terror, suddenly screamed, "He was going to kill us! He killed our dad! Please help us!" The man's face twisted with rage. "Shut up!" he snarled at the children. Then, making his decision, his hand darted toward his holstered gun. Jake didn't hesitate. He fired. The rifle shot echoed through the forest like thunder. Jake's bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing to the ground. The man's gun fell from his holster, landing several feet away in the dirt. Jake moved forward quickly, keeping his rifle trained on the fallen man, and kicked the gun further away. "Stay down," he commanded. "Next one won't be a warning shot." The man groaned, clutching his shoulder where blood was seeping through his jacket. His eyes held murderous rage, but he remained on the ground. Jake pulled out his satellite phone. Cell service was non-existent out here, and called 911, his voice remarkably steady as he reported the situation. "This is Jake Coleman. Coordinates 43.7904 north, 110.6818 west. I have an active crime scene, attempted murder, possibly kidnapping. 3 victims including 2 children, 1 adult female injured. Perpetrator down with a gunshot wound to the shoulder. I need law enforcement and medical evacuation immediately. Be advised this is 3 miles into wilderness, accessible only by horse or helicopter." While keeping the rifle trained on the wounded man with one hand, Jake used his flashlight to better assess the victims. The woman tied to the tree was conscious now, her eyes wide with terror and hope. The children were clinging to each other, sobbing but alive. "You're safe now," Jake said to them, his voice gentle despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Help is coming. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." Jake noticed something else in the flashlight beam. Another body, partially covered with dirt, lying at the edge of what the man had been digging. Jake's stomach turned. The girl had said, "He killed our dad." This man had already murdered someone and was preparing to eliminate the witnesses. The wounded man on the ground spoke through gritted teeth. "You just signed your death warrant, old man. You have no idea who you're messing with." "I know exactly what I'm messing with," Jake replied coldly. "A coward who murders fathers and terrorizes children. And I know that Wyoming law gives me the right to use lethal force to protect innocent lives. So if you make one more move, I won't hesitate to finish what I started." The Palomino Mustang had moved closer during the confrontation and now stood near the children, as if standing guard. Jake noticed something he hadn't seen before. The horse had old scars on its flanks, marks that suggested it had once been subject to abuse or violence. This Mustang knew what evil looked like and had made a choice to fight against it. 25 minutes later, the longest 25 minutes of Jake's life, he heard the sound of helicopter rotors. A searchlight swept through the trees, and within minutes, law enforcement officers were rappelling down into the small clearing. Sheriff's deputies from Teton County, along with emergency medical personnel, took control of the scene with professional efficiency. As paramedics attended to the woman and children, providing warming blankets and medical assessment, and other EMTs treated the wounded criminal under armed guard, Sheriff Tom Bradshaw approached Jake. "Mr. Coleman, you just saved 3 lives tonight," the sheriff said. "We've been looking for this man for 2 days. Robert Hastings, wanted for the murder of Daniel Morrison in Jackson Hole. The victims are Morrison's ex-wife, Karen, and their 2 children, Emma and Tyler. Hastings was Morrison's business partner. There's a lot of money involved, and apparently Hastings decided to eliminate everyone who could testify against him." The crime scene investigation continued through the night, with additional law enforcement arriving by helicopter and on horseback. Portable lights were set up, transforming the dark forest clearing into a surreal tableau of police activity. Jake learned the full story in fragments as investigators interviewed him. Daniel Morrison had discovered that Robert Hastings was embezzling from their construction company, nearly $2 million over 5 years. When Daniel confronted Hastings and threatened to go to the police, Hastings had murdered him in what was initially staged to look like a hunting accident. But Hastings panicked, worried that Daniel had left evidence behind. He kidnapped Karen Morrison and her children from their home, intending to murder them and make it look like they'd fled after killing Daniel themselves. He'd brought them to this remote location specifically because he knew the area. He'd been hunting here for years and knew about the old mining area where bodies might never be found. What Hastings hadn't counted on was a wild Palomino Mustang with a mysterious protective instinct and a stubborn old cowboy who would follow that horse into the darkness. Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife veterinarian, called to the scene to check on the Palomino, who had saved everyone, examined the Mustang from a respectful distance. The horse allowed her proximity, unusual for a wild animal, and she noted the old scars Jake had observed. "This horse was definitely domestic at some point," Dr. Chen explained to Jake and Sheriff Bradshaw. "These scars suggest severe abuse, probably beaten, possibly starved. At some point this Mustang either escaped or was abandoned, but it retained memory of humans, both the bad ones who hurt it and the potential for good ones who might help." "So, when it encountered this situation," Jake said slowly, "it recognized a threat. It understood those children were in danger." "That's my theory," Dr. Chen agreed. "This Mustang has seen violence. When it encountered Hastings terrorizing these children in the forest, something in the horse's memory was triggered, and instead of running from humans as most wild horses would, it made a choice to seek out help." Sheriff Bradshaw shook his head in amazement. "How did the horse know where to find you?" Jake thought about that. My cabin is probably the closest human habitation to this area. If you're an animal in distress looking for help, you go to the nearest signs of human activity. Smoke from my chimney, lights, sounds. The horse came to the only source of help available. Karen Morrison, After receiving medical treatment and having her bonds removed, approached Jake with her children. Her face was bruised and swollen, one arm in a sling, but she was alive. Emma and Tyler clung to their mother, wrapped in emergency blankets, their young faces showing trauma that would require years to process. "You saved our lives," Karen said, her voice breaking. "That monster was going to kill us. Kill my babies, and that horse. That beautiful horse somehow knew to find you." Jake knelt down to Emma's level. "You were very brave," he told her, "taking care of your little brother out here. Your dad would be proud of you." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "The horse stayed with us," she whispered. "Before you came. The bad man was digging, and we were so scared, and the horse just stood there between us and him, like it was protecting us." Jake looked over at the Palomino Mustang, which was grazing calmly now despite the chaos of law enforcement activity around it. The horse raised its head and looked directly at Jake, and for a moment, man and animal shared something beyond words. Mutual recognition of a life-changing moment, of choices made that defied instinct and expectation. Robert Hastings survived his gunshot wound and was charged with first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, kidnapping, and a dozen other charges. The evidence was overwhelming. He would spend the rest of his life in prison if he managed to avoid Wyoming's death penalty. Daniel Morrison's body, which Hastings had hidden in the wilderness and claimed was lost in a hunting accident, was recovered and given a proper burial. Karen and her children began the long process of healing, with therapy and the support of family and friends who had never believed Daniel's death was an accident. But the story that captured national attention was the Palomino Mustang who had saved 3 lives by deliberately seeking human help. News crews descended on the region. Jake, uncomfortable with publicity, gave only a handful of interviews, always deflecting attention from himself to the horse. "I just followed where I was led," Jake told reporters. "That Mustang is the real hero. He found them, stayed with them in the freezing cold, then came and got help. I've worked with horses my whole life, and I've never seen anything like it." Dr. Sarah Chen conducted extensive research on the Mustang, whom the local community had started calling Guardian. Wildlife cameras placed in the area revealed that Guardian had been staying close to the crime scene for several hours before finally going to seek Jake's help. The horse had literally stood guard over the terrified children while Hastings dug their would-be grave, the Mustang's presence apparently unnerving Hastings enough that he'd hesitated in his terrible plan. "This horse made a series of complex decisions," Dr. Chen explained in a paper she later published. Guardian recognized that the children were in distress, assessed that they needed help beyond what a horse could provide, left them temporarily to seek human assistance, remembered the location of the nearest human habitation, successfully communicated urgent need to that human, and led him back through difficult terrain in darkness. That's extraordinary cognitive ability and problem-solving. The Bureau of Land Management made an unusual decision. Guardian would be allowed to remain free, but would be monitored and protected. The area where he typically ranged would be designated as protected habitat, and anyone attempting to capture or harm the Mustang would face federal charges. Jake returned to his quiet life in the cabin, but everything had changed. Emma and Tyler visited regularly with their mother, bringing apples and carrots for both Dakota and Guardian. The wild Palomino began appearing near Jake's property more frequently, not quite domestic, but no longer fully wild either. A unique bond had formed between man and horse, forged in darkness and violence, but resulting in life and hope. 6 months after that terrible night, Jake stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in brilliant colors. Guardian grazed peacefully in the meadow near his cabin, having shown up that afternoon as had become his habit. The Mustang looked healthy and strong, his golden coat gleaming in the fading light. Jake thought about the randomness of fate, how he happened to have that cabin in that location, how Guardian happened to range in that area, how Hastings happened to choose that particular spot for his terrible crime. Remove any one of those elements, and Karen, Emma, and Tyler would be dead. But there was nothing random about Guardian's choice. The Mustang had seen evil and had consciously decided to fight against it. The horse had overcome instincts of self-preservation and fear of humans to save lives. Dakota walked up to the porch railing, and Jake patted his loyal horse's neck. "You've got a pretty special friend out there," Jake told Dakota, "a wild horse with a hero's heart." As if hearing his words, Guardian raised his head and looked toward the porch. For a long moment, man and Mustang regarded each other across the meadow. Then Guardian returned to grazing, content in this strange new existence, no longer truly wild, but not domestic either. Something in between, something extraordinary. Jake went inside to start dinner, grateful for the isolation he'd once sought and the unexpected purpose it had provided. He was just an old cowboy who'd followed a horse into the darkness. But that simple act, prompted by an animal's desperate plea, had changed everything. Robert Hastings is currently serving life without parole at Wyoming State Penitentiary. Karen Morrison and her children have relocated but maintain close contact with Jake Coleman, whom they credit with saving their lives. Emma Morrison, now 9, has started therapy horse riding and hopes to work with horses professionally when she's older. Guardian continues to range freely in the Bridger-Teton National Forest and visits Jake's property regularly. Dr. Sarah Chen's research on Guardian has been published in multiple journals and has influenced discussions about wild horse intelligence and cognition. Jake Coleman continues to live in his cabin and occasionally guides law enforcement when search and rescue operations are needed in the wilderness areas he knows so well. Wyoming's governor awarded Jake a Civilian Medal of Valor, which he accepted on behalf of Guardian, stating that the real hero had 4 legs and a brave heart. If this incredible story of a wild horse fighting against evil, a cowboy's courage, and the salvation of an innocent family moved you, subscribe for more extraordinary true stories. Hit that like button, share this video, and tell us in comments, do you believe animals can recognize evil and consciously choose to fight against it? Thanks for watching, and remember, sometimes the wildest hearts are the bravest, sometimes darkness is defeated by unlikely heroes, and sometimes following where we're led in faith can mean the difference between life and death for someone desperately in need of rescue.